I deeply believe that in order to shift from a culture of blame and punishment to a culture of care and compassion and the word is escaping me, but when you develop compassion for yourself, when you watch this documentary and you explore how trauma affected yourself, and a lot of people think of trauma in this very dramatic way, but trauma is not necessarily dramatic. And most of us have experienced trauma in our childhood, chronic stress, and it has impacted us, and we tend to be very hard on ourselves. When we start developing compassion for ourselves, we develop that muscle is the same for others. And so as we develop compassion for ourselves, we develop compassion for others, and it changes our interaction, and it changes the way we even pursue justice, pursue changes, because we think, well, let me understand, right? Like before I can judge, before I can move to action, I got to understand what's happening, understand that person and their perspective. Then the second aspect is that when we understand, really deeply understand the impact of trauma, then we think twice before we traumatize others, right? As a communal body. I'm not talking about like when you are traumatizing somebody in your life, right? Your child, your partner, your community, you're probably not in control, right? You're doing your best and your best is not good enough. But when as a country we pass policies that separate children from their parents and incarcerate them, and every doctor explains that we are literally traumatizing these children and that this is a medical, it's not a psychological term. We are medically damaging these children, and that the impact of that will be very long term. And we're not just talking about psychological impact, not to undermine depression, anxiety, suicidality. I mean, these are major illnesses. But medical, other kind of medical costs too, in terms of cancer, stroke, heart, risk of cardiovascular diseases. I mean, we're talking about an incredibly long-term impact on these children, and just suffering, an incredible amount of suffering. So when we start understanding how trauma works and how it's preventable, it's an epidemic. Right? People like Nadine Burke-Harris talk about trauma as a national epidemic. When we have an epidemic, we can deal with it on a public health level. We can start thinking of healthcare for all, not as some luxurious or socialist endeavor, but as a way to actually end this epidemic and actually lower the cost to our country as a whole. Then when we think about other kinds of interventions that can happen and are not happening, like at-home visits for a new mother and things like that, that can really reduce the impact of childhood trauma. So there's all or other kind of family-friendly policies, universal childcare, etc. Right? You can start thinking about the world from a lens of trauma. Incredibly transformative. And you can also start looking at racism and sexism and other cultural violences, systemic violence from a lens of trauma. And it helps, again, develop compassion and also start thinking about how do you remedy this? How do you really deeply remedy these problems?